This is India. Today it has one of the fastest growing and largest economies in the world. But just over 100 years ago, the story was very different. So how has India gone from an impoverished colonial state to one of the rising great powers of today's world? My name is Anish, and in this video, I'm going to explain India's entire 20th century. And as someone of Indian origin, this is going to be very patriotic. Just kidding, I'm going to roast my country like everyone else is. And without further ado, this is the story of India's entire 20th century. Here's a bit of context. So about 400 years ago, India gets a knock on its door. Knock knock, who's there? It's the British with the East India Company, and they want to do some trading. Eventually this trading turns into the exploitation and conquering of Mughal and Marathi territory, and after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the East India Company was officially abolished and was replaced by formal British rule over India, with Queen Victoria as the monarch and the first empress of the British Raj. Now India was known as the crown jewel of the British Empire. No other European state had a colony remotely comparable to the size and population of India's, so it was a pretty big deal. This colony was technically split up into areas that were formerly under British rule and about 500 princely states, which had some internal autonomy, but pretty much everything else from defence to foreign policy was controlled by the British, and there was a vague doctrine that these princely states were under British rule. But who actually governed a population of over 300 million people? Well, it was the position of the Viceroy of India that was the supreme ruler of British India, and his capital was based in Calcutta. The Indian Civil Service administered all government activity, and of course this was pretty much exclusively made up of Brits. The colonial economy was mainly orientated to serve the needs of the British economy, and that meant India was very poor. In the late 19th century, you have some of the worst famines in human history, and things were not looking great for India. Industry was very underdeveloped, and the vast majority of Indians lived in villages. But there was an educated middle class that was developing who were looking to change things. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded, and remember these guys, they're important. Originally, this organisation was made up of educated elites, and by no means were they political activists. It was actually founded by a British guy called A.O. Hume, and all they wanted was for Indians to have a greater representation in the civil service and broader Indian participation in politics. We would describe the Congress as mainly made up of moderates, but we soon see a more extreme wing of the Congress emerge, led by these guys. And if you want a quick way to remember them, think of Lal, Bal and Pal. These extremists declared independence as the goal of the nationalist movement, and they were prepared to use more violent measures to get there. These extremists split from the moderates in Congress in 1907, but they'll pop up here and there in the nationalist movement. But I also have to address that India is also extremely diverse, and was home to a lot of different religions, the largest of which were Hinduism and Islam. The British loved a bit of divide and rule tactics, and from the late 1800s, they started to pit these two groups against one another. You have the growth of something called communalism. That means that you're loyal to your own ethnic group or religion, rather than to wider society. For example, you would say, first I'm Hindu, then I'm Indian. Or first I'm Muslim, then I'm Indian. And you can see how that might be a problem here. In 1906, the All India Muslim League was founded, and its foundation proved that some Muslims believed that the Indian National Congress failed to represent their interests. While the British absolutely loved these issues and always kept a special interest in the Muslim League as a way of curbing the influence of Congress. But the British also got into a bit of trouble in Bengal. So Bengal was the biggest province in India, with a population of nearly 18 million people. The Viceroy Lord Curzon argued that the state was too big to administer effectively, but it also happened to be the centre of the rising Indian nationalist movement, so the British had to do something about it. Without even consulting the Bengali leaders, in 1905 the province was split into two parts. With an eastern province predominantly Muslim and the western province predominantly Hindu, it was clear that Bengal was being divided along religious lines and that there was some darker tactics going on here. Nationalists were outraged, and they launched the Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi, literally translating to one's own country, was a self-sufficiency movement started by the extremist leaders of Congress and advocated for the boycott of all imports, especially British textiles, in favour of the use of Indian goods. This brought in the first era of mass mobilisation of the people, and Indian nationalist poetry and journalism flourished. This concept of Swadeshi is something that Gandhi will one day take forward in his teachings, that political freedom lies on the basis of economic freedom. Eventually, in 1911, the partition of Bengal was annulled and Western and Eastern Bengal were reunited. Then, to distract everyone, the capital was shifted from Calcutta to Delhi, and they had a major celebration for the new Emperor of India, George V. So a couple years on, and World War I starts in Europe in 1914. The British are fighting Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. But the British also have a massive global empire, and they all chip in to help. Indian nationalists strongly supported the First World War, and they believed that a grateful Britain would repay India's loyalty with a big step towards self-rule. Over 1 million Indian soldiers would fight in the First World War, mainly serving in Mesopotamia against the Ottomans. There was also this slightly odd plan for British India to annex Mesopotamia and turn it into a mini-colony within a colony. Ironic, I know, but that didn't exactly work out. Okay, so here's a quick summary of the Mesopotamia campaign. So the British and Indian soldiers made really good progress in early 1915, reaching nearly 40 kilometers of the major city of Baghdad. But the Ottoman counterattack pushed the Allied troops all the way back to the city of Quds, where over 14,000 troops were under siege for nearly 5 months in what was described as one of the worst defeats of the Allies in World War I. Reinforcements came in from Western India, and Quds was recaptured and Baghdad fell in March 1917. All in all, around 65,000 Indian soldiers were killed in World War I, relatively low in comparison to the other Allied powers, but its contribution cannot be understated. Anyway, back at home, just as World War I started, a man named Mohandas Gandhi was coming back from nearly 20 years in South Africa. There, Gandhi developed his ideas of non-violent resistance and civil disobedience. He spent the wartime years travelling around India and understanding the problems of the Indian peasantry. He was kind of the first nationalist leader to identify his life with the common people, as Gandhi gave up his Western clothes and pushed towards the abolition of untouchability and for Hindu-Muslim unity. When the Allied powers won the war, the nationalists were expecting some serious political gains. The Government of India Act of 1919 was introduced, which basically said that the control of some aspects of provisional government will be given to elected Indian officials, and that in about 10 years, a commission will be set up to decide whether India is actually fit for self-rule. From what the nationalists were demanding, this was basically a slap in the face. To rub salt into the wound, the Rowlatt Act was passed, which authorised the government to imprison anyone without a trial and heavily censored the Indian press. To rub even more salt in the wound, the Spanish flu just arrived in India and killed probably up to 20 million people. In 1919, nationwide protests against the Rowlatt Act were occurring. In April, a large peaceful crowd gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, Punjab. British Brigadier General Dyer was told to take care of the situation, and as his soldiers entered the garden, they blocked off all the exits and without warning, fired upon the unarmed crowds, killing nearly 400 people in what was known as a Jallian Bagh massacre. To top it all off, all that happened to General Dyer was that he was relieved of all his posts and sent back to England, where the public had amassed over £26,000 for him, with the newspaper labelling him as the saviour of the Punjab. The use of brutality and lack of accountability stunned everyone, especially Mahatma Gandhi, who turned against the view that India had a rightful place within the British Empire. He launched a nationwide non-cooperation movement in 1920, adopting the non-violent principles of Satyagraha. For the next few years, India witnessed a wave of strikes, protests, and boycotting of British goods in the largest display of organised protest ever witnessed. Gandhi became the leader of Congress in 1921, and by this time, the organisation had transformed from a handful of elites to a movement of the masses with over 2 million members. Congress revealed to the masses the pervasive racism in Indian society, and that India does not need just political freedom, but also cultural, social, and economic freedom. In 1922, an incident occurred in which an angry mob kind of sets fire to a police station, killing 25 people. Gandhi didn't want the movement to take a violent turn, so he called it off altogether and was arrested. Interestingly, in the Great Trial of 1922, he requested that he be given the maximum penalty and used the trial as a platform to openly criticise British rule. Gandhi was released from jail in 1924, and he got the reputation in Britain as quite the troublemaker. And then remember that commission I was talking about earlier? Well, in 1928, the Simon Commission was officially established, which was meant to evaluate whether India was actually fit for self-governance. And of course, this commission was exclusively made up of Brits, and not a single Indian was involved in the process to decide India's future. To counteract this, a father-son duo of Motilal and Jawaharlal Nehru put forward the Nehru Report, which demanded an Indian parliament and dominion status. But again, there was no assurances from Britain that India would gain dominion status, and so on the 26th of January 1930, Nehru proclaimed the Purna Swaraj Resolution, which demanded complete independence from the British, and the famous tricolour flag of India was raised. In my last video, the Indian nationalist movement has just started, and it ends with the Lahore Resolution of 1930, in which the Indian National Congress declares Purna Swaraj, or complete independence from the British Empire, as a goal of the nationalist movement. Time to introduce our major players. In one corner, you have the Indian National Congress, which is led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi. Both Nehru and Gandhi were Western educated, and they both adhered to the principles of non-violence and civil disobedience. Then you have the All India Muslim League, which is led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And this organisation was basically created because they felt that Congress did not represent the needs of India's Muslims. For the past few decades now, there has been a major rift between India's Hindus and Muslims, and the idea of communalism was taking hold. To put Purna Swaraj into action, Gandhi launched a massive civil disobedience movement in 1930 by launching the Salt March. You may ask, what on earth is a Salt March? Basically, through a series of laws, Indians weren't allowed to produce or sell their own salts, and they were forced to buy expensive, heavily taxed salts from the British monopoly. Gandhi chose to challenge this specific law because it affected all sections of Indian society. He once said, "By taxing salt, the state can reach the starving millions, the sick, and the utterly helpless." Gandhi marched nearly 400 kilometers through his home state of Gujarat, and at Dandi he picked up a handful of salt in defiance of this law. Anyways, this galvanized the entire country around the campaign and brought widespread international attention to the Indian independence movement. Throughout 1930, demonstrations, protests, and civil disobedience took hold across India, and Gandhi became a household name. The government of India met the challenge with repression and jailed over 60,000 satyagrahis, including all the Congress leadership, and declared the organisation illegal. Gandhi and the British Viceroy eventually came to an agreement in 1931 called the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, in which all political prisoners will be released, and in return, Congress will suspend the civil disobedience movement, and will negotiate India's future peacefully in London. In these roundtable conferences, very little much was actually achieved. Britain just would not give in to India's demands for dominion status, and the division between the Congress, Muslim League, the princes and minority groups meant that no real agreement could be achieved. Eventually, the Government of India Act of 1935 was passed, which introduced elections in India for the first time. But like the Government Act of 1919, the 1935 Act was a massive slap in the face to the nationalists. Nehru actually called it a new charter of slavery. Maybe a slight exaggeration, but the British still had almost all the political and economic power, and it also allowed separate electorates for minority groups, and this was just another way to create more division amongst Indians. Either way, the Congress still swept the floor in the 1937 elections, taking 7 out of the 11 provinces. At this point, the Muslim League started playing off the fear of the Congress Raj, the idea that if Congress dominated India at a federal level, this will lead to more discrimination against Muslims down the line. Alright, so a couple years later, in 1939, Hitler was just being Hitler and starts the Second World War in Europe. Britain declared war on Germany, and without even consulting the elected Indian officials, the Viceroy simply informed the Indian people that they're at war too. Nehru saw this conflict as a war between rival imperial powers, and one that India should never be involved in. Congress wished the Allies well, but they expressed their neutrality and agreed to only join the war if Britain promised independence. Well, that wasn't going to happen, and all the Congress ministers resigned from government. The Muslim League actually supported the war effort, and with Congress out of the picture, the League absolutely took off. The Lahore Resolution of 1940 put forward the two-nation theory of a separate state for India's Muslims. Interesting facts, the word Pakistan was never actually mentioned in this speech. But staying away from high politics, the Second World War dragged on for a while, and Britain was brought to the brink of defeat and avoided a close call in 1940. After Hitler invades the Soviet Union, Japan then attacks Pearl Harbor and began their rapid expansion into Southeast Asia. Japan then wipes out Indonesia, the Philippines and Malaysia within a matter of months, and then they reached Burma, right on India's doorstep. The Indian army had mobilized its people on a much greater scale than the First World War, with 2.5 million men serving in Burma, North Africa and Europe. The Burma campaign saw the British, the Indian, American and Chinese forces all engaged to fight the Japanese. But the Japanese also got help from a certain Subhas Chandra Bose, who was the president of Congress only a few years before. Have you heard of the phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend"? Well, that guy took it way too literally, and he collaborated with Nazi Germany and Japan. He created the Azad Hind Provisional Government and the Indian Nationalist Army from Indian prisoners of war, with the aim to liberate India from British rule. The existence of the Azad Hind proves to the British how far some Indians would go to fight for independence, and his legacy even today is divisive. The period between April and August 1942 saw the Japanese move closer and closer to India, and the threat of invasion looms. Britain needed to get the nationalists on their side, so in March 1942, the Cripps mission offered Dominion status after the war ended. But both Gandhi and Jinnah outright rejected this. In August 1942, Congress then passed the famous Quit India Resolution and proposed a complete end to British rule in India. And the classic British response was to put all the Congress leaders in jail. Until the end of the war, there will be very little political activity in India, but we do see the mainstream rise of the Muslim League. In 1943, we have one of the most tragic events in the war with the Bengal famine, in which 3 million people died. Many say that the famine was created by colonial policies, as much needed resources such as grain and rice were diverted to supply British forces in the Middle East and Europe. The war would eventually end with the Japanese surrender in 1945, and the Indian troops finally returned home. So after the war, a couple things have changed. For one, Britain are no longer the lean, mean fighting machine it used to be, and would take years for its economy and military to recover. The USA and the Soviet Union became the two great powers in the world, and they both supported Indian independence. The British Labour government under Clement Attlee came in, and trust me, if you want independence from the British, you do not want Winston Churchill in charge. It was pretty clear that India was going to secure independence, and in February 1947, Attlee declared that Britain would leave India by June 1948. The last British Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, came in and said that he could do one better, and that the British would leave India in 6 months instead. Mountbatten made sure that the cameras and media saw 200 years of British rule ending in warm smiles and handshakes. Now the big question remains about whether India's Muslims had a place in an independent India. Of India's 350 million strong population, around 25% were Muslim, and were concentrated mainly in the northwest and east of India. The bottom line of the Muslim League's message was that so long as Muslims remained in the minority in India, Islam was in danger. Gandhi proposed to make Jinnah the Prime Minister of India, but the Muslim League would accept nothing less than Pakistan. Then in Calcutta and Punjab, communal violence between Hindus and Muslims started to erupt. In the end, despite protests from Gandhi, it was decided that the country would be partitioned. So Nehru, Jinnah and Mountbatten now had 6 months to plan Britain's exit and divide the country. Cyril Radcliffe was a man in charge of drawing the border in 6 weeks, and of course this man had never stepped foot in India before. It was decided that the states of Punjab and Bengal, both with large Hindu and Muslim populations, would be split between India and Pakistan. On the 14th of August 1947, Pakistan achieved independence with Muhammad Ali Jinnah as its first head of state. A day later, on the 15th of August, India declared independence from the British, with Jawaharlal Nehru as the first Prime Minister of India. In his speech he stated, "At the stroke of midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awaken to life and freedom." But unfortunately, independence is also shadowed by the scars of partition. With the boundaries announced a few days after independence, people found themselves either in India or Pakistan. Millions of people found themselves on the wrong side of the border and forced to move from their family home, which many had lived in for centuries. Between August and October, one of the largest mass migrations in human history occurred, with around 15 million people making the journey across the border. Both sides committed acts of violence and atrocities, and around 1 million people lost their lives. And India and Pakistan got off to a very bad start. They had an even worse start when a conflict started to emerge in Kashmir. Okay, so remember in the first video when I said that there are roughly 500 princely states spread across British India? Well, at independence, these princely states had the option to join either India or Pakistan. But some were like, screw both of you, I'm going to start my own country. And that's exactly what happened with the princely states of Jammu and Kashmir. Kashmir was a majority Muslim state with a Hindu king and wanted to remain independent. But for Pakistan, this was a Muslim state and therefore belonged in a Muslim country, with the K in Pakistan actually standing for Kashmir. But then for India, as a secular country, it saw no reason why it should just give up Kashmir on the basis of religion. In October 1947, tribal partisans from Pakistan entered the Kashmir Valley to bring the region fully under their control. Fearing an invasion, the Maharaja of Kashmir turned to India for military help, and in exchange, Kashmir agreed to join India afterwards. India then airlifted troops into the state capital, and thus the First Indo-Pakistani War had begun. Fighting continued for over a year, and the UN brokered a ceasefire. India controlled about 2/3 of the state territory, and Kashmir acceded into India. But to this day, Kashmir remains a real roadblock in Indo-Pakistan relations. Then in the massive state of Hyderabad, slightly different story. Again, it was a former princely state, but a Hindu majority population and an insanely wealthy Muslim Nizam, who wanted Hyderabad to remain independent and was building up a personal army to help him out with that. In September 1948, Home Minister Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel launched Operation Polo and used the Indian army to annex Hyderabad and bring the region into the Indian Union, finally ending the princely state problem. But some bad news. In June 1948, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in New Delhi by a Hindu extremist, who believed that Gandhi was being too sympathetic towards the Muslims and Pakistan. Gandhi was a man who helped India to independence, whose face is on every Indian banknote today, and whose principles of non-violence and civil disobedience would carry on long after his death. A few years on, and India officially cut all ties with the British Crown and became the Republic of India in 1950. India's constitution was absolutely massive, but the bottom line was that India was to become the world's largest democracy with civil libertarian values at its core. So this is my last video on India's 20th century, and it's going to cover Indian history from independence to the turn of the century. Okay, so my last video ends with British rule coming to an end, and India and Pakistan being declared independent states. There were a fair few early issues with Partition and Kashmir, and let's just say these countries did not get off to the best start. So Jawaharlal Nehru becomes the first Prime Minister of India, and in 1947 the country had a lot of problems to fix. To list a few, only around 14% of the population could read and write, India was still heavily reliant on food imports, and long-standing inequality was still a major issue. But Nehru was always an idealist, and he believed that under his guidance, India will undergo a rapid social and economic transformation. If you've ever heard of socialism, well, Nehru and the Congress Party were a big fan of the stuff. He introduced Soviet-style 5-year plans, and he thought that the best chance India has to modernize is to start nationalizing industry and for the government to take an active role in all government sectors. Nehru initiated the nationalization of Indian railways and steel, and his successes will take his policies forward even more. But India also wanted to hold the title as the world's largest democracy, and the first elections in 1951 was at this point the largest experiment with democracy in history, with 173 million voters. A lot of post-colonial states can't say this, but since independence, India has had regular and free elections, apart from a small blip in the 1970s, but we'll get to that. Then we have foreign policy under Nehru, which is also really interesting. So you probably know that after World War II, a little thing called the Cold War was starting. The world was split into two hostile blocs, one led by the Soviet Union, who championed communism, and one led by the USA, which championed capitalism. But Nehru believed that the newly independent countries of Africa and Asia have nothing to gain from joining these power blocs, and their needs lie in combating poverty and colonialism. Nehru was instrumental in organising the Bandung Conference of 1955, and this led to the basis of the non-aligned movement, which proposed that countries should abstain itself from allying itself with one of the two superpowers, and instead join together to promote national self-determination and anti-imperial movements around the world. The cool thing about non-alignment is that you can develop ties with countries on both sides of the divide. For example, the Soviets give you tanks, the Americans give you grain. The Americans give you technology, and the Soviets give you weaponry. It's kind of like two divorced parents fighting for their child's approval. However, eventually, Pakistan would become close allies with the US, and India would start to lean towards the Soviet Union. Anyway, to the north of India, you have China. A few years after India won independence, Mao Zedong and the Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War, and there was a big question about the relationship between the two largest powers in Asia. At first, things went pretty well. India is one of the first countries to recognize the People's Republic of China, and they had agreed on the 5 principles of peaceful cooperation in 1954. But when China annexed Tibet, it brought the countries in direct contact with each other, and then China starts to dispute its border territories of India. Eventually, India gave refuge to the Tibetan government in exile and the Dalai Lama, and things started to escalate on the border with China. Finally, in 1962, China launched a massive preemptive strike into Aksai Chin and the NEFA, completely catching India off guard, and before the Indian army could prepare for a full-scale war, China declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew. In the aftermath of the Sino-Indian War, the Indian army was completely humiliated, and Nehru's career never really recovered from the betrayal from the north. Nehru died a few years later in 1964, after guiding the country for nearly 2 decades after independence. Lal Bahadur Shastri comes into office, and although he wasn't there for long, his rule was definitely eventful. Across the border in Pakistan, General Ayub Khan and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto hoped to take advantage of a politically and militarily weak India, and in 1965 went to war again. The Pakistani military sent troops to occupy the disputed Rann of Kutch region in Gujarat, and then sent hundreds of thousands more into Kashmir. Indian forces then counterattacked and crossed the border, and came dangerously close to Lahore. Both sides agreed to a ceasefire, and after the humiliation against China, the Indian army had restored some pride and prestige. But during the peace negotiations in Tashkent, Shastri died of a heart attack in 1966. In comes Indira Gandhi, and no, she's not related to Mahatma Gandhi. There'll be no examples of nepotism in Indian politics. Just kidding, she's actually Nehru's daughter. Collectively, Nehru and Indira Gandhi ruled modern India for nearly 32 years. When Indira came in, she needed to address India's rapidly growing population, so she pushed for the green revolution of agriculture, as India went from a food-deficient country to one of the world's largest producers of wheat and rice. A pretty notable achievement, and for the first time since independence, India became self-sufficient in food production. But just like her father, Indira was also a big fan of socialism, and wanted some more radical reforms and started nationalising India's largest banks, its insurance industries, and rapidly implemented land reforms. She had a deep affinity for the poor and marginalised in India, and she actually ran for the 1971 election with the slogan, "Remove poverty, save the country." She won this election in a landslide, but on the day that she was sworn in, a new crisis started to emerge in East Pakistan. Alright, so after independence, Pakistan was created, but was split into two parts, an eastern wing and a western wing, and about 1,000 miles of a hostile India in between them. Despite East Pakistan only making up about a sixth of Pakistan's territory, it made up over half the country's population, and a few problems stood out. For example, in East Pakistan, the vast majority of people spoke Bengali, but Urdu was imposed as the official language of the nation, leading to language riots in the 1950s. Also, Pakistan had a bit of a history with military dictators, and so with these leaders, they made sure that all political and economic power was concentrated in the West Wing. Pakistan had its first free general elections in 1970, and to many people's surprise, the Awami League led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in East Pakistan won by an absolute landslide, taking 99% of the seats in the east. Fearing a shift of power to East Pakistan, a military crackdown was launched, and during Operation Searchlight, hundreds of thousands of Bengalis, possibly even millions, were massacred. Bangladesh proclaimed its independence from Pakistan in March 1971, and thus the Bangladesh Liberation War had begun. Around 10 million refugees fled to India, creating a humanitarian crisis. But Indira Gandhi remained cool and collected. Of course, India wanted to stick it to Pakistan wherever it can, and so India gave sanctuary to the Bangladesh government in exile, and the Indian army helped to arm and train the Bangladeshi freedom fighters, the Mukti Bahini. To prevent US and Chinese intervention in the war, India signed a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation with the Soviet Union and temporarily abandoned non-alignment. Finally, on the 4th of December 1971, Indira Gandhi sent in the Indian army into East Pakistan, marking the beginning of the Third Indo-Pakistani War. The Indian army quickly overran the country within 11 days and took the capital Dhaka. The Pakistani army surrendered, and Bangladesh became an independent country. Indira Gandhi's leadership and toughness came out really well from the crisis, and she became incredibly popular with the people. But within only a few years, this popularity would completely unravel. Okay, so in the 1970s, the Indian economy faced some real challenges. It was hit really hard by the global oil crisis, and inflation and food shortages led to massive strikes in Gujarat and Bihar, and law and order completely broke down. To make matters worse, the Allahabad High Court ruled that Indira engaged in electoral malpractice in the 1971 elections. Mrs. Gandhi was expected to resign from office. Well, that didn't happen, and instead, Indira declared a state of emergency in 1975 and suspended all civil and political rights. Within the next few months, more than 100,000 of her opponents were arrested, and the press was strictly censored, which wasn't exactly the most democratic thing to do. The state of emergency lasted for nearly 2 years, and in that time we see the rise of Indira's son Sanjay Gandhi, who became a slightly controversial figure. Sanjay became notorious for the demolition of slums in major cities, and starting a compulsory sterilisation program of young men to curb population growth. Perhaps Mrs. Gandhi thought that the emergency had gone too far, or perhaps she thought that she could legitimately win power again. But either way, everyone was completely taken by surprise when she lifted the state of emergency and elections were announced again in 1977. Both Indira and Sanjay lost their seats, and Morarji Desai became the first non-Congress Prime Minister of India. It didn't last long though, as Desai's Janata Party began to disintegrate, and in 1980, Indira Gandhi was back in business. But on the lighter side of things, in 1983, India won its first Cricket World Cup, and the sport absolutely skyrocketed in the country. And yeah, India loves its cricket. However, the following year, the country was again brought into crisis, this time in the state of Punjab. So Punjab is the only majority Sikh state in India, and in the early 1980s, some Sikh separatists started to demand their own Sikh nation, Khalistan. Some extremists armed themselves and took up residence in the Golden Temple in Amritsar, the holiest site in the Sikh religion. Negotiations with the militants failed, and in 1984, Indira Gandhi launched Operation Blue Star and attacked the separatists in the Golden Temple. Hundreds of people were killed, including innocent Sikh pilgrims, and many Sikhs saw this as an attack on the Holy Temple and an attack on their religion. 5 months later, Indira Gandhi was walking around in her residence in New Delhi when two of her own bodyguards, both Sikhs, fired on her and assassinated the Prime Minister. So after Indira's assassination, she was succeeded by her son, no, not Sanjay, her other son, Rajiv Gandhi. See, India may have been the world's largest democracy, but politics definitely had its favourite family. So when Rajiv Gandhi came in, there's a whole bunch of problems to fix. He had to send in the army to sort out the horrific anti-Sikh violence in Delhi, but there's also a few issues in the south. Okay, so Sri Lanka was going through a period of major instability. To briefly summarise, the two largest ethnic groups in Sri Lanka were the Sinhalese and the Tamils. Since Sri Lanka achieved independence, the Sinhalese government had implemented a few policies to squeeze out the Tamils, such as the burning of Tamil scripture and supporting anti-Tamil riots. India has a massive Tamil population, and when the Sri Lankan Civil War broke out in 1983 between the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan states, there was a massive pressure for the Indian government to help the Tamils. So Rajiv Gandhi sent in an Indian peacekeeping force to end the civil war. But what ended up happening was a completely different story. The Sinhalese resented a foreign army coming in, and the Tamils were not happy that the peacekeeping force were disarming the Tigers. And soon a conflict started to emerge between the Tamil Tigers and the Indian peacekeeping force. It was basically a lose-lose situation, and getting sucked into this conflict in Sri Lanka, many even call it India's Vietnam War. Anyway, back at home, Rajiv Gandhi did a pretty great job in dealing with the drought of 1987, and he then started to open up the economy, notably bringing in a telecommunications revolution. But Rajiv Gandhi also had the title of Mr. Clean, aka he doesn't do anything shady. Well, when the Bofors and the Fairfax scandals started coming in, it looked like Rajiv may have been getting his hands dirty, and the government stank of corruption. Whether or not these allegations were true is another question, but Rajiv Gandhi ended up losing the 1989 election, and whilst campaigning in 1991, he was assassinated by a suicide bomber from the Tamil Tigers. In 1991, Narasimha Rao comes in, and with his finance minister Manmohan Singh, they wanted to change things. If you look at China, which actually started off in a very similar position to India, and pretty much remained identical in development until the 1980s, well, thanks to Deng Xiaoping's liberal economic reforms, China has skyrocketed past India, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, it became pretty clear that full guns-blazing free market policies was the future. India made a major shift away from Nehruvian socialism and started to cut government regulation and privatise industry. In the next few years, foreign investment into India started to rise, Indian industry began to develop, and a new middle class emerged. Successive governments will continue economic liberalisation, and although there's still a lot of work to be done, the larger India's economy becomes, the more powerful it will be on the world stage. Anyway, in the 90s we also see the rise of Hindu nationalism. In 1992, the Babri Masjid Mosque in Ayodhya was demolished by a Hindu mob. The story, according to them, was that the mosque was built on a pre-existing Hindu temple and the birthplace of the god Rama. Whilst for Muslims, they valued it because they believed that it was built by the founder of the Mughal Empire. In the aftermath of the demolition, communal riots took hold across the subcontinent and served as a pretense for the 1993 Bombay bombings. In the next few years, the pro-Hindu, right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party gained power, and in 1996, Vajpayee became the 10th Prime Minister of India. India officially joined the nuclear club by conducting nuclear fission explosions in the Pokhran Range in 1998. And luckily, none of these new weapons were used when India went to war again with Pakistan the following year. As you enter the 21st century, there's some clear problems facing India, such as hostile neighbours, rural-urban inequality, and corruption. But there are some major positives to take away, such as extreme poverty being wiped out at an extraordinary rate, and a wealthier Indian state being able to invest in infrastructure, education, and healthcare to improve the lives of ordinary people. That pretty much sums up the entire 20th century. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you did. The next country I'm going to cover may step on a fair few controversial topics. It's of course Germany. See you then.